Eyes as Blue as Night, a Lego Monkey Kid fanfiction written by Jukebox Straws, read by Jukebox Straws. Wukong, it's me. A hand slowly caressed the stoic, expressionless face, running a thumb across frighteningly cold skin. It's me, it's Luir. Macaque brought his other hand up to the king's face. The kid needs you. Please. He can't do this alone. Hopeful golden eyes stared into icy blue. The king's expression was still blank, staring straight ahead. Please, Wukong, look at me. Macaque gently tilted Wukong's face, turning the sage to look at him. Wukong limply turned, giving in to Macaque's touch, as if his head was on a swivel instead of a neck. Mouth pressed into a thin line, skin as cold as ice, lips a deathly blue. If Macaque hadn't seen the possession himself, he would have guessed that he was now standing in front of a walking corpse. The warrior closed in on the hero, so close that he could have kissed those cold lips if he wanted. He could barely feel his breath. This wasn't Sun Wukong. Sun Wukong was warm, brave, and inviting. This creature wasn't any of those things. They need you, Macaque whispered softly against the sage's mouth. Macaque didn't see Wukong's finger twitch. I need you. The warrior blinked when he noticed the drop of liquid in his hand. He looked up. Blazing blue eyes now shed tears. Wukong! Wukong, can you hear me? Macaque held the king's limp hand in his grip. Come on, Monkey King! The kid still believes in you. Macaque! The shadow demon went stiff, skin going rigid, blood as cold as ice. She appeared in her true form. Perhaps the child's body had finally given out. The presence behind him made him retract his hands from the king's face. Macaque inhaled sharply and squeezed his eyes shut as he felt ghostly fingers trail over his cheek, barely grazing near the base of his ears. You've taken quite a liking to our corrupted king, I see, her voice whispered. Macaque gulped and said nothing as his hands twisted into the fabric of his scarf. Why do you insist on continuing to betray me? He knew the question was rhetorical, so he didn't answer. Instead, he let out the breath he had been holding as he felt her blue smoke circle both him and Wukong. The king stared straight ahead, waiting for his cruel mistress to give her command. Macaque watched those unblinking eyes disappear into the mist, and he waited, fists curled at his sides and his tail swishing with worry. Go, came the whisper. A fist slammed into Macaque's back as he let out a scream of surprise. The shadow fell forward onto the floor and quickly rolled out of the way, avoiding another punch from the possessed monkey. Wukong stepped over the dent in the floor left behind by his fist. Macaque's ears perked at the sound of the king's cracking knuckles. Wukong! Macaque tried to summon a shadow, something, anything. Blue mist covered every nook and cranny, every place a shadow could be. He couldn't even summon his staff. Macaque was powerless, weak, helpless, and alone. He was alone with this monster. The body lurched forward. Macaque backed up further, a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Every time Macaque tried to sink into the mist, drown himself in shadows, he'd be pulled back to the light by those cold hands. He was thrown across the room, slammed into walls, punched, kicked, choked. He was bruised, battered, and bleeding on the ground, surrounded by that mist as the sage loomed over him. Another punch to the face. Macaque had turned so his blind side would get hit. He spat blood onto the floor and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. Why don't you fight me yourself, you coward? Macaque growled, hiding his dread and terror beneath a blanket of honor. Why waste my own time when fate has gifted me a real champion? Came her answer. A champion far better than his measly shadow. Icy fists grabbed Macaque's scarf and lifted him off the floor. His boots dangled off the ground and his scarf tightened around his neck. Now, you disgrace. Look into the eyes of your final failure. The shadow demon gripped Wukong's wrists and opened his eyes. The right side of his face burned as he felt blood dripping down his face. What a pretty eye you have. Her cold fingers pressed into his scarred skin, making it burn. He let out a scream of agony as her nails split open his skin, her fingers digging in, reopening scars that had long since healed. Why don't we make them match? Macaque gasped as his hair was grasped and his head turned to the side. Wukong raised a fist. Wukong, I need you. His last desperate whisper, as a tear ran down his face, mixing with the blood already there. Goodbye, my champion. Macaque couldn't see. He couldn't move. All he could hear was his heart pounding, the ringing in his ears, someone calling his name. Macaque! It was muffled, barely a word. Macaque! His hand twitched. He tried to get up. He had to get up. Macaque! MK? Macaque tried to open his eyes, but he found he couldn't. Macaque, oh my gods! What happened? MK? Macaque fought past the migraine that threatened him. He managed to sit up, feeling his surroundings with his hands and tail, hearing every little sound and breath as his 6 ears came out from the veil of glamour. MK, I can't see. Why can't I see? Macaque. The warrior felt the boy take his hand. Macaque, your other eye. Macaque nearly stopped breathing. He didn't need MK to finish his sentence to know what happened. Some sick, twisted part of his mind told him that it was about time that it happened. Oh, gods! MK held onto the sniffling, bleeding macaque as the rest of the group caught up with him. They all stared in horror at the horrid, bleeding mess that was the shadow demon's face. Scars ripped open, blood pouring from the gaping wound that was once his left eye. Completely blind. He'd never see Flower Fruit Mountain again. He'd never see MK again. He'd never see Wukong again. The last thing he ever saw was those stoic eyes, blue and lifeless, taking what was so precious to him without remorse. His king once again at the mercy of another. And Macaque was still there, paying the same price as he did before, the same price for his failure. Once a bright and brave warrior, basking in the light of an eternal sun. Now he still lives, forever drowning in the shadows as he cries out for the cruel mercy of death. The end.